It struck noon, then 11, then 10. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. You all make this mystery circle glow. Let's begin. It was the sort of late summer day St. Irvan's called perfect. Warm, but not oppressive, with the kind of breeze that nudged lace curtains rather than rattled them. Bees hummed drunkenly over hydrangeas, and children's laughter skipped across hedgerows like pebbles on a still pond. The Reverend Allgood's garden party was in full swing, its trestle tables sagging beneath fruit scones, Battenberg slices, and home-churned ice cream beginning to consider its future as soup. Miss Marple sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, a delicate teacup nestled between thumb and forefinger. She wore dove grey, a hat with 3 modest violets, and an expression of soft but amused interest. Her eyes, bright beneath the gentle shade of her brim, moved with subtle attentiveness. Not to the vicar's daughter's endless apologies about the clotted cream, but rather to the way Mrs. Jerome stiffened every time the word clock was uttered near her, and to the curious, deliberate detachment with which young Horace Hale, returned from London for a rest, examined his own village like it were foreign terrain. "Isn't it lovely, Jane?" said Mrs. Bantry, sinking into the seat beside her with the air of one who has carried 3 too many empty cups. "I told Letitia to add ginger to the shortbread, and it's made all the difference." "It often does," said Miss Marple, smiling gently. "A touch of heat where one doesn't expect it." Mrs. Bantry laughed, then lowered her voice. "Do you know, I swear that fellow from the museum, what's his name? The one with the hair like a thundercloud. He's been watching Reverend Allgood's silver candlesticks all afternoon." Miss Marple's eyes didn't follow the direction Mrs. Bantry indicated. They didn't need to. "Mr. Feeney," she murmured, "is not as interested in silver as he is in time." "Time?" "Yes. Watches. Pocket ones especially. I overheard him telling young Alice Minette that watches reveal more about a man than his diary. Such a curious thing to say, don't you think?" Mrs. Bantry gave a little huff. "Curious, and rather theatrical, if you ask me." Miss Marple did not reply. Her gaze was now on Reverend Allgood himself, who had just clinked his spoon against his tea glass for attention. He smiled at the gathering. "My friends," he began warmly, "thank you for indulging me with your presence this afternoon. It's a small thing, but marking time with one another is a sacred act, I believe. In that spirit, I have a little surprise." He gestured, and his housekeeper, stout and breathless, came forward with a small velvet pouch. From it, he drew an ornate pocket watch, deep brass, engraved with curling, ivy, the kind of piece that looked as though it told more than hours. "This," the Reverend said, "belonged to my great-uncle. He was a peculiar man who, for reasons best left to the family's dusty corners, had it altered to run backward. Yes, backward. It has been restored, and today I intend to auction it for the benefit of the Bell Restoration Fund. Mr. Feeney of the local museum has generously offered to verify its odd authenticity." There was a murmur of interest, half polite and half truly intrigued. Mr. Feeney stepped forward with a thin smile and spectacles that glinted rather too severely for the light. He examined the watch with theatrical flair, turning it over, adjusting his pince-nez, and finally declaring, "Yes, it's one of the rarest reverse movements I've ever seen. Mechanically sound, eccentric, yes, but genuine." The Reverend beamed. "Splendid. Then let us begin with a starting bid of, £10. A flurry of amusement followed. Hands rose. The bidding rose with them. Miss Marple tilted her head just slightly. She was not watching the auction. She was watching Mr. Horace Hale, whose foot tapped faster with every pound added, and Mrs. Jerome, who clutched her napkin so tightly the embroidery bled into her skin. She was watching time. It was nearly an hour later when they found the body. Young Alice Minette, pale and prone to dramatics, had gone to the vicarage kitchen in search of a spoon for her peach trifle. She had screamed, then fainted. and when the guests rushed in, some gasping, others fascinated, they found Mr. Feeney, the museum man, collapsed on the floor beside the larder, one hand outstretched, one leg twisted underneath him at a grotesque angle, his eyes wide open. The watch was gone. Reverend Allgood's face turned a terrible shade of white. Mrs. Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Good heavens! Murder, do you think?" Miss Marple said nothing for a moment. Then, very softly, "If so, it was marked in hours before it happened." And her eyes drifted to the space on the table where the watch had once rested, where now only a faint ring of brass polish remained, and beneath it, unnoticed by all in the commotion, a single, small, dried petal of violet. The sun, still warm but leaning into its descent, cast long amber shadows over the garden as the guests lingered, caught in that thick, uncomfortable suspension that follows the unthinkable. The laughter and music had ceased. The scent of roses and scones now mingled with something far more pungent. Anxiety. And under it all, a strange hush had settled over St. Hervans, as word of Mr. Feeney's sudden death began to stretch beyond the vicarage gate and curl down the lanes like smoke from a smouldering hearth. Miss Marple stood near the edge of the garden, where the lawn met the gravel drive. She said nothing, not yet. Instead, she watched how people moved in grief and in fear, those twin engines that so often revealed more than any police interview ever could. Mrs. Jerome, usually composed to the point of frostiness, was seated on the wooden bench near the trellis, her handkerchief pressed against her temple as though it might calm the paleness there. She'd barely said a word, but her eyes flicked constantly toward the vicarage door, where Sergeant Mackell had just arrived and was being ushered inside. Horace Haley stood with one arm wrapped round his waist and the other pressed against his lips, as though to keep his thoughts from tumbling out. 2 fingers tapped a feverish rhythm along his jaw. Behind him, Alice Minott was being comforted by her mother, who fussed over her daughter's hysterics with the briskness of a woman embarrassed by such displays. Miss Marple approached no one, not directly. She moved slowly, softly, as though she too were just another concerned friend, too elderly to be intrusive, too gentle to be questioned. And in doing so, she heard things. "They say it was natural causes," whispered Mrs. Smythe Faulkner, always the first to embrace a conclusion if it let her resume afternoon gin. "A fall, perhaps. He was looking pale earlier, wasn't he?" "Pale," Mrs. Lockett replied with a pinch in her voice. "He was snooping. That's what he was doing. I saw him in the vicar's study not an hour before it happened. Had no business being in there. He said he was looking for the loo, but honestly, why bring a pencil and notebook?" Miss Marple allowed the words to slip over her like rain over slate. It wasn't that they were useless. Village talk never was, not entirely. But they had to be sorted, weighed. Most people lied unintentionally. They reshaped the truth to soothe themselves, often before their lips had fully formed the sentence. Inside the vicarage, Sergeant Mackell had begun his questioning. Reverend Allgood was stiff and shaken, his knuckles still white from where he'd wrung his hands. "He was going to appraise the watch," the Reverend said. He'd taken it to look more closely, offered to do so privately, away from the distraction of the garden. Said it would only take a few minutes in better light. "And when did you last see him alive, sir?" "Oh, 20 minutes before Miss Minott found him, I believe. He left the garden by the kitchen path." "And no one saw him after that?" "Not to my knowledge, but it's all a bit, well, muddled." Outside, the garden had emptied of all but a few lingering guests, and those close enough to the Reverend's household to remain under the pretense of helping tidy up. But of course, no one was folding tablecloths. Instead, they waited for gossip to return from the kitchen like smoke from a chimney. Miss Marple stood before the empty table where the watch had once rested. Her eyes passed over the tablecloth, the trays of half-eaten cake, the spot of raspberry preserve staining a napkin. And then her gaze fell again to the small, curled petal, violet, faintly crumpled, almost lost in the weave of the linen. She did not touch it, but she noted its placement, Directly in the space where the watch had been, Mrs. Bantry came bustling toward her, her movements edged with a kind of flustered indignation. "Well," she said, "Sergeant McKell's already calling it a tragic accident. Though between you and me, Jane, I've known enough accidents to know when something smells off. And this one smells like burnt sugar on a cold plate." Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "People don't tend to collapse in kitchens without leaving something behind. A sound, a mark, a movement." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "You think someone helped him fall?" "I think the Reverend's larder is not particularly treacherous, and Mr. Feeney did not strike me as particularly frail. His spectacles were still on his nose when they found him. Curious, don't you think? A man who falls so hard he dislocates his hip yet leaves his glasses untouched." Mrs. Bantry blinked. "I hadn't thought of that." "Most don't," Miss Marple said quietly. "It's an ordinary detail, and ordinary details often go unquestioned." Later that evening, the talk had reached nearly every sitting room in St. Ervon's. Mr. Feeney had, apparently, succumbed to a cardiac event. This was the whisper making its rounds. The doctor had been summoned, the constable had reported nothing visibly violent, and the museum man's peculiar interest in backwards timepieces had been reframed as eccentric rather than sinister. But not everyone accepted the official murmurs with relief. Horace Hale, back at the cottage he'd inherited from his aunt, stood by the window smoking with a trembling hand. He hadn't bid on the watch. He hadn't needed to. That wasn't why he'd returned. He closed the curtain quickly when he saw a figure walking up the lane, Miss Marple of all people, headed toward the butcher's at this hour, and Mrs. Jerome, pacing before her fireplace, stared at a small brass key she kept hidden in a velvet pouch in her sewing drawer. She hadn't meant to bring it, but something about seeing that watch, its shape, its gleam, had broken open a memory she'd kept shut for 20 years. At the vicarage, Reverend Allgood sat with a cold cup of tea, staring into the dark hallway beyond the sitting room, as though expecting Mr. Feeney to come back with his notebook and a peculiar comment about horology. The Reverend's mind was not on the death, not quite. It was on the letter he'd received a week prior from a solicitor in London, about an estate, about a watch. He had not told anyone about it. And in her small, neat cottage on Church Lane, Miss Marple sat before her writing desk, arranging a few observations in her head, as one might arrange flowers for clarity rather than beauty. Her fingers paused over a bit of embroidery she hadn't touched since the morning, and she thought again of the violet petal, and of something Mr. Feeney had said that no one else had noticed. Watches reveal more about a man than his diary. Perhaps that was true. But sometimes, Miss Marple thought, they also reveal who wanted to erase time, and why. She leaned back slightly, her expression as peaceful as ever. But her mind was already turning gently backward, following a pattern no one else yet saw. And the watch, wherever it had gone, had not simply been stolen. It had been replaced, or altered, or both. The violet had not fallen by accident, nor, she suspected, had Mr. Feeney. The next morning arrived with a thin mist lying low over St. Ervon's hedgerows, making the village look like it had fallen asleep with a damp cloth laid across its brow. There was a hush to the streets, a kind of collective pause one often found the day after tragedy, when polite conversation still circled the edges of the event, but had not yet dared to speak its name with confidence. At the vicarage, Reverend Allgood had taken breakfast alone. His appetite, such as it was, had waned beneath the weight of both sorrow and inconvenience. He had received 2 telephone calls already, one from the Archdeacon expressing concern, the other from a man named Mr. Ainsley at the County Museum Board. Both inquiries had danced around the question of the watch's whereabouts. He had, of course, no answer to give them. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had not wasted the morning. She had walked to the greengrocer's early and made a point of passing Mrs. Jerome's house along the way. The curtains were still drawn on the upper floor. That, in itself, was unusual. Mrs. Jerome prided herself on her efficiency. She was known for polishing brass at 7:30 and opening her windows before the first kettle had boiled in the village. Miss Marple noted the detail with the same quiet interest with which she noticed the distinct lack of gossip being exchanged outside the baker's. The village, for once, had gone unusually silent, and when it did speak, it spoke in questions. "Have they found it yet?" whispered Mrs. Lockett to the postman as he handed over her circulars. "The watch?" "No one says anything," he replied. "But I heard they found fingerprints on the larder door that didn't belong to Mr. Feeney." Miss Marple did not pause as she passed them, but her mind tucked the comment away with precision. She had no doubt that fingerprints would be found, but more interesting than whose they were would be the question of why they were there. The larder was rarely used in summer. The Reverend's household made do with an ice chest these days, and anything stored behind the heavy wooden door tended to be jars of chutney and boxes of candles. It was just past 10 when she arrived at the cottage of Dr. Lionel Havers, the local physician, and a man whose sense of propriety had always run parallel to his sense of discretion. He opened the door himself, dressed not in his usual brown suit, but in shirt sleeves and an old cricket jumper. "Miss Marple," he said, slightly surprised, "to what do I owe the—" "I thought I might trouble you with a small question," she said, her voice light. "Just a matter of clarification, really." He hesitated only slightly before ushering her in. She was, after all, not a woman easily turned away, and her presence often preceded interesting revelations. "I shan't keep you long," she said, seating herself primly in the chair beside his writing desk. "It's simply about Mr. Feeney. I've given my statement, you know, to Sergeant McKell. Heart attack, likely brought on by stress. His leg was broken from the fall, but the death itself quick, likely painless." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and very convenient." Dr. Havers blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Oh, I don't mean in any dreadful way. But it is rather curious, isn't it, that a man with no history of heart trouble, visiting a vicarage garden party, should expire so efficiently the very moment a valuable item goes missing?" He leaned forward slightly, fingers steepled. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting foul play?" "I never suggest, Doctor. I simply observe. You say there was no sign of struggle?" "None." "Nothing knocked over? No bruising? No blood?" "None." "And the watch?" He frowned. "Gone, of course." "Quite gone, but quietly, as though it had never been." She stood, brushing down her skirt gently. "You see, Doctor, I believe Mr. Feeney did not fall as we were meant to believe, nor do I believe he died in the larder at all." Dr. Havers looked startled. "But he was found there." "Yes," she said softly. "Found, not necessarily killed." She thanked him for his time and left the cottage with a calm step, but her mind was turning with quiet certainty now. The theory had not fully formed, but the bones of it were there, rattling gently in the background. A watch, stolen, a man, dead, and a petal. A single petal placed not on the body, but where the watch had once rested. She returned to Church Lane, and was not surprised in the least to find Mrs. Bantry waiting near her garden gate, pretending to admire the rose bush that hadn't bloomed properly since May. "Well?" Mrs. Bantry demanded the moment Miss Marple appeared. "You've seen Dr. Havers, haven't you?" Miss Marple gave a little nod. "Yes. He's ruled it natural causes." Mrs. Bantry looked disappointed. "But you don't believe it?" "I believe Mr. Feeney was frightened shortly before his death." "Frightened?" "Yes. His behaviour yesterday, watching the watch so intently, and then asking to examine it away from the crowd. He must have realised something. Perhaps something about the watch itself, or about the person who wanted it." Mrs. Bantry narrowed her eyes. "And you think someone followed him into the house?" "No," said Miss Marple. "I think he followed someone." It was late afternoon when Sergeant McKell returned to the village with a report that sent new ripples through the quiet. A search of Mr. Feeney's hotel room had uncovered several notes scribbled in shorthand, a half-packed bag, and, most intriguingly, an envelope addressed to Reverend Allgood containing a typed document labelled transfer of possession. What possession? Mikel asked aloud at the vicarage table. There's no inventory attached. Reverend Allgood, genuinely baffled, held the letter with both hands. I hadn't seen this before. Miss Marple, seated to one side, leaned slightly forward. And yet, the Reverend received a letter a week ago from a solicitor regarding an inheritance. Did he not? All eyes turned to her. You were overheard discussing it on the telephone, she said gently. By the gardener's boy. He mentioned it to the butcher's lad, who then told his mother. It's quite harmless, but revealing. The Reverend flushed. Yes, I did receive such a letter. From a man named Ainsley, about a relative I barely knew. He left me something in his will. They said it was a personal item. A watch. Sergeant Mikel's brow lifted. The watch that went missing? I assume so, though I hadn't received it yet. Not officially. Miss Marple clasped her hands gently. But Mr. Feeney had it, and perhaps he realized it was not the watch it claimed to be, or perhaps someone else did. Someone who had a reason to retrieve it before it could be examined too closely. Mikel frowned. You're saying someone switched the watch? Miss Marple's eyes met his calmly. I'm saying the watch at the auction may not have been the original at all, and that Mr. Feeney may have noticed something that made him realize as much, something worth killing for. The room was silent. Outside, the village clock chimed 5. Miss Marple stood slowly. It's time, she said gently, that we asked who had the most to gain by the absence of the watch, not by its presence. And that, I think, will take us somewhere quite unexpected. And as she walked home that evening, the mist returned to the hedgerows. But Miss Marple walked as if each footstep brought her closer to something solid. The watch had not simply been taken, it had been hidden, and not just from view, but from memory. By the following morning, a quiet unease had settled over Sainte. Ervans like dust over an untouched mantelpiece. The villagers went about their errands with less chatter than usual, their greetings more subdued, their glances a touch more guarded. There was something unfinished in the air, something that had yet to be named, and everyone felt it, even if they pretended otherwise. Miss Marple had not slept poorly. On the contrary, she had rested quite well. But even in the depths of the night, her mind had continued its steady stitching. It had followed the thread from the stolen watch, through Mr. Feeney's theatrical remarks, and into the strange, taut silence that seemed to bind several of the party's attendees. She had long since learned that in villages like Saint-Hervins, nothing was ever truly forgotten. It merely waited to be seen again in a different light. That light came sooner than expected. At 9:30, Horace Hale knocked on her door. He looked haggard, his usual composure thinned by something sharper than grief. She invited him in with a calm gesture, noting the way his eyes flicked about her sitting room, restless and searching, as if he feared being overheard even in solitude. "I hope you don't mind," he said quickly, sitting before she'd finished pouring the tea. I needed to speak to someone. I'm quite used to that, Mr. Hale," Miss Marple said gently. "People often do when something has unsettled them." He fidgeted with the brim of his cap. "It's about Mr. Feeney and the watch." Her fingers paused on the teapot. "Yes? I didn't want to come forward in front of the police," he said in a rush, "because I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the vicarage study. But I saw him, that afternoon, just before the announcement. Feeney. He was in the study alone, and I watched him for a moment from the corridor." Miss Marple did not interrupt. Her silence was its own invitation. "He had the watch open on the desk," Horace went on, voice low. "And he wasn't admiring it, Miss Marple. He was angry. I could see it in his face. He took out a little magnifying glass and kept looking at the inside cover. He said something too, though I couldn't hear all of it. Only 2 words. 'It's wrong.' And then he slammed the case shut." "Did he see you?" Horace shook his head. "I left quickly. I didn't want him to ask what I was doing there. I had been looking for something else entirely, Something you had left behind? Miss Marple asked kindly. He hesitated, then gave a single, miserable nod. A letter. From my mother. And it was in the study? Years ago, he said. She sent it to the Reverend for safekeeping. Something private. It was never meant to be read by anyone else, I think. I had only just learned it still existed. I hoped I might retrieve it before anyone else found it. Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I believe you, Mr. Hale, she said at last. And I also believe that Mr. Feeney discovered something about that watch that made him very afraid. You may have been the last person to see him before he died. Horace's hands clenched in his lap. You think it was murder? I think, she said slowly, that someone desperately needed that watch to vanish, and someone else needed to make sure it didn't. Those motives are rarely separated by much time at all. As he left, she watched his silhouette move down the lane, shoulders hunched against something larger than the breeze. She had seen men like Horace before, drawn back to the past by guilt and secrets, not ambition. He was frightened, yes, but not calculating, not cruel. That same morning, Sergeant McKell made his second visit to Mrs. Jerome. He had, as he later admitted to Miss Marple in confidence, never liked the woman. She was too polished, too poised, too sharp-eyed for his liking. She had the air of someone who judged without blinking. But she received him graciously, and even offered him tea. She wore a pearl-grey cardigan and a brooch in the shape of a swallow. Her house, as always, smelled faintly of lemon oil and starch. Mr. Feeney, she said, lifting one finely arched brow. No, Sergeant. I had no particular acquaintance with the man. We exchanged pleasantries, nothing more. McKell nodded. You were sitting quite near the display table, I believe. I was, yes, out of curiosity. The vicar's parties are rarely entertaining. Do you remember when the watch was last seen? She sipped her tea. Moments before Alice screamed. It was there, and then it wasn't. I assumed someone had been watching for the right moment. McKell hesitated, then laid a small linen cloth on the side table. Wrapped within it was a dried violet petal. This was found where the watch had been, he said simply. Mrs. Jerome looked at it for a moment too long. Then she leaned back in her chair. And? We've asked several ladies who were seated nearby whether they'd worn violets. You're the only one who admitted to having them in your hat. She smiled coolly. Then I must be guilty of a terrible crime, Sergeant. Floral association. I'm not accusing you, but you were nearest to the table. And it's curious how a petal managed to fall so neatly in the exact place where the watch vanished. Her expression held. Wouldn't that rather suggest the person who removed it was not me? I'd hardly draw attention to myself with a trail of petals. McKell made no reply, but as he left her front gate, he saw a figure waiting for him halfway down the lane. Miss Marple, of course. He had come to expect her subtle ambushes by now. I wonder, she said softly, falling into step beside him, if we might speak plainly. Did Mrs. Jerome seem nervous to you? He frowned. Number, if anything, too calm. Cold, even. She is often like that, Miss Marple agreed. But today, she did something rather telling. What was that? She did not ask what the petal meant. McKell blinked. But a normal person would have asked why you showed it to her, or how it was relevant. She accepted the implication without a blink, which tells me she already knew what you meant by it, which, of course, only one person truly could. McKell exhaled through his nose. So you think I think she knows what the watch truly was, or rather, what it contained. He stopped walking. Contained? Miss Marple gave a small nod. You see, Sergeant, a watch is a perfect hiding place for something small, precious, and easily overlooked. Not money, no. That would be vulgar. But a key, perhaps, or a sliver of paper, or something far older. Something that might bind two people together through secrets. She let that linger for a moment before continuing in her soft, even tone. I believe Mr. Feeney discovered something inside that watch that made him realize it had been tampered with. And I believe someone, perhaps someone who feared what might be revealed, made sure he did not speak of it. And the petal? A mark, she said. A signature, perhaps. Or a message. Some women do not shout when they wish to be heard. They simply leave something behind. Mikkel glanced back once toward Mrs. Jerome's tidy house, her bright white curtains like closed eyes in a sleeping face. Inside, the secrets were still there. But Miss Marple knew that secrets, like clocks, could only run backward for so long before time caught up with them. And this time, it was ticking. The following afternoon brought with it a strained stillness that seemed to press against the windows of St. Ervon's like a held breath. Rain clouds hovered, undecided, casting a grey pall over the thatched roofs and hedgerows. The village, normally unbothered by such temperamental skies, felt smaller somehow, contracted into itself by secrets too large to bear out in the open. Inside her modest drawing room, Miss Marple was sewing, her needle passing through linen with the same quiet precision her mind applied to every observation made since the Reverend's garden party. Her fingers moved steadily, but her thoughts were fixed elsewhere, on the sequence of events, on Horace Hale's frightened eyes, and most of all, on the curious placement of that violet petal. The knock at her door did not startle her. She'd half expected it. It was Alice Minute. The girl looked pale, her usual flushed cheeks now muted, and her expression tremulous. She clutched her handbag with both hands as though afraid it might fly from her grip. Miss Marple invited her in with a soft gesture, already setting aside her needlework. "I'm sorry," Alice blurted as she sat. "I didn't know who else to talk to." "That's quite all right," said Miss Marple, offering a cup of tea. "There's no better remedy for a troubled conscience than a good cup and a willing listener." Alice didn't smile, though she did accept the tea. She stared into the steam for a long moment before speaking. "It's about Mr. Feeney. I saw him too, just before he was found, but I didn't tell anyone." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "And why didn't you, my dear?" "Because I was hiding," Alice whispered. "Not on purpose at first. I was in the vicar's study. I'd gone in to fetch the hymn sheet I'd left there from rehearsal. But when I heard voices in the hallway, I got nervous. I didn't want anyone to think I was snooping, so I slipped behind the curtain. I was going to come out, but then Mr. Feeney came in." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers curled more tightly around her teacup. Alice's voice dropped further. He was muttering to himself. He had the watch in his hand, open. He said something about a name not matching. Then he started tearing at the back panel with a little tool. "And did he find something?" I think so." He stopped and just stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "That old woman's a fool. She had no idea what she had." Miss Marple was silent for a beat. Then softly, "And then?" "He put it in his pocket and walked toward the larder. I think he meant to hide whatever it was he found. Or maybe compare it to something else. I don't know. But then someone else came in." Alice's eyes filled with frightened tears. "I couldn't see who. It was just a shadow on the floor from where I was. But I heard a voice, a woman. She said, 'You should have left it alone, Feeney.' And then..." Her breath hitched. "Then what, dear?" "There was a sound, like something heavy falling, and I heard his breath, like he was choking. And then... nothing. I stayed hidden until I heard people running. I was so scared." Miss Marple didn't reach out. She let the silence stretch gently until Alice gathered herself. "You did the right thing by telling me," she said at last. "It's not easy, being young and frightened and in the wrong place at the wrong time." Alice blinked. "Do you think the woman killed him?" "I think the woman believed she had no choice," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze distant. "And that is often more dangerous than malice." Later that day, Miss Marple took a walk to the churchyard. not because she expected revelation among the gravestones, but because the path took her past 3 houses of interest: Horace Hale's, the vicarage, and Mrs. Jerome's. Horace was in the garden, trimming roses with an energy that bordered on desperate. He saw her pass, but didn't wave. At the vicarage, the Reverend stood beside the compost heap, hands folded, staring into nothing. He didn't seem to notice her at all. And at Mrs. Jerome's, the curtains were now open. Too open, as though to signal normalcy, to project a calculated innocence. Miss Marple paused, just briefly, and her eye caught a glint in the window. A small brass frame. Inside it, a pressed violet. Not a coincidence. She continued to the church, where she found Sergeant McKell standing near the vestry gate, talking quietly with Dr. Havers. "They're ruling it natural causes officially," he said, when Miss Marple approached. "No bruising, no sign of struggle. It's all circumstantial, without witnesses." "There is a witness," Miss Marple said gently. They looked at her. Alice Minnitt saw the moments before his death. She didn't recognize the voice, but she heard enough. "And I believe I know what Mr. Feeney found inside the watch." McKell's eyebrows rose. "You do?" Miss Marple nodded. "Not precisely, but I believe it was something tied to an older crime, a secret that had been sealed inside the watch for decades. Perhaps a letter, a name, a confession, something that would implicate the wrong person, or reveal a lie someone has built a life around." Dr. Havers looked troubled. "But who would have planted it there?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her words were direct. "I believe it was hidden long ago, by a man who regretted what he'd done but couldn't bring himself to destroy the evidence. So he placed it in the only thing that ran counter to the truth. A watch that ticked backward." She turned to McKell. "I think you'll find the original watch wasn't lost at all. It was exchanged, before the auction ever began. Mrs. Jerome wore gloves at the garden party, didn't she?" McKell nodded slowly. "Yes. White lace. She didn't need to wear gloves in that weather, but she did. And I suspect you'll find faint traces of brass polish on them still." She replaced the real watch with a copy and left the petal as a message, not to the world, but to someone specific, perhaps to remind him what she knew. McKell's voice was cautious. "And you think she killed him?" Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly, "No. I think she meant to frighten him. But something went wrong. A heart attack, perhaps. Yes. But it was fear that triggered it. Fear and pressure. She likely didn't touch him at all." "But if we can't prove what was in the watch, then we must watch how she behaves," Miss Marple said. "Guilt, like time, leaves traces, even when it runs backward." She looked up at the darkening clouds, her eyes sharp beneath the shadow of her hat. "There's still one more thing I must see, something buried long before the watch was ever made public. And when I find it, I believe the rest of the story will come to light." She turned back toward the village. The path ahead was quiet, but her step was certain. Some secrets told time. Others were time. And someone, somewhere, was running out of both. The following morning arrived with a thin drizzle, the kind that seemed indecisive about becoming rain. It gave the air a cool weight, and a damp sheen clung to the iron gateposts and cottage window panes along Church Lane. Miss Marple, unbothered by the weather, tied her scarf more snugly beneath her chin and stepped out into the grey light with a clear purpose. There was one place she hadn't yet visited, one person she hadn't questioned directly, not because she'd overlooked them, but because timing mattered. She had learned, long ago, that truth ripened like fruit, and if you plucked it too soon, all you tasted was bitterness. The path to the vicarage garden was muddy, but she took it with care, passing the now empty trestle tables stored beneath canvas and the once cheerful rose arches that had witnessed a murder. It was strange how quickly such spaces could change, how joy, once interrupted, left a silence that no bunting could fill. The Reverend Allgood opened the door himself. He looked thinner somehow, though only a few days had passed. His collar sat slightly askew, and he blinked when he saw her, as though struggling to remember what day it was. "Miss Marple," he said, surprised. "Please, come in." He led her into the sitting room, where a fire had been lit against the chill. She declined tea with a gentle smile and remained standing, her gloved hands folded lightly before her. "Reverend," she began, "I wondered if you might answer one or two small questions, strictly to satisfy an old woman's sense of untidiness." He nodded, still off balance. "Of course, I'll help in any way I can." "You told Sergeant McKell that you had never seen the contents of your great-uncle's watch, that it had been passed to Mr. Feeney for appraisal and authentication." "Yes," the Reverend replied. "It arrived by post. There was a brief note from the solicitor, no inventory or description. I assumed it was merely ornamental." "And you said you had no knowledge of its previous whereabouts?" "Only that it had been in the estate of a distant cousin." Miss Marple inclined her head. "That cousin being the late Mrs. Lillian Hartstone." He blinked again. "Yes, I believe that was the name, though I never met her." "Lillian Hartstone," she said softly, "was once a music teacher here. Briefly, before your time. She left under a cloud, or rather, under something more silent than a scandal. Whispers of impropriety, but nothing proved. She vanished quite suddenly, with no forwarding address. But those who knew her remembered her talent, and her jewellery, in particular, a brooch shaped like a violet. The Reverend stiffened slightly, though she noted how he tried to mask it. "I didn't know any of this." "No, of course not. But someone else did. Someone who kept the watch for years and ensured it never came to light, until the solicitor made a mistake and passed it on to you instead of someone else, a person who had more to lose." She let the words hang in the air. The fire cracked softly. "You see, I don't believe the watch was sent by mistake at all. I believe Mr. Feeney knew exactly what he was doing. He sent it to you to provoke a reaction. From the person who had once hidden the truth inside it. The same person who would recognize it at once." The Reverend rose and walked to the mantel, staring at the framed photograph of his predecessor. He spoke without turning. "And you believe that person is Mrs. Jerome?" "I do," said Miss Marple, her voice calm. "And I believe Mr. Feeney knew she would be at the garden party, knew she would see the watch on display, that she might even try to retrieve it before its contents could be revealed. But what he didn't expect was that she would beat him to it." He turned to face her. "You're saying she switched it?" "Yes, just before the auction began. She had a nearly identical watch, an empty one, perhaps acquired years ago for just such a contingency. She used her gloves. She left the violet petal, and then she waited. But Mr. Feeney had already examined the real one. He knew, and he followed her inside, intending perhaps to confront her, or bargain." The Reverend sank slowly into his chair. "And she killed him?" "Number, I don't believe she did. Not by hand. But the shock, the fear, the tension, it was too much for him. His heart gave out. She left him there and took the real watch with her." He looked up. "And what's in it, Jane? What does the watch hold?" Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, carried the weight of certainty. "A confession, or at least the memory of one. Lillian Hartstone had an affair with a married man, a man who later entered the clergy. There were letters, love letters. She was forced out when someone threatened to expose her. I believe she hid the letters, miniaturized versions perhaps, inside the back of the watch. The man, racked by guilt, arranged for the watch to disappear. It passed through hands until it reached the solicitor's office, where Feeney discovered its history and saw a scandal he could finally profit from." She paused. "And Mrs. Jerome, who knew the truth all along, and who had protected that man's reputation for decades, acted." The Reverend's face was grey. "Who was the man?" Miss Marple's gaze was kind. That doesn't matter anymore, not really. He's long dead. But his legacy lives in the watch. And now, I fear, it is in Mrs. Jerome's possession again. A long silence followed. Then the Reverend whispered, "What will you do?" Miss Marple looked at the fire, as though reading the past in its flicker. "I shall do nothing, for now, except observe. But I imagine that Mrs. Jerome is already making plans. She'll either try to destroy the watch or hide it again. Either way, she will leave a trace. They always do." That afternoon, Sergeant Mackell returned to the station to find a small package waiting for him. No return address, but addressed in familiar handwriting. Inside was a pocket watch, and beneath it, a single pressed violet petal. Miss Marple received the call while brewing her evening cup. "She gave it up," Mackell said, still baffled. "No letter, no explanation, just the watch, and that petal." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Guilt, Sergeant. It moves slowly, like time in reverse, but it moves. And what do we do with it now?" "You read what's inside," she said. "You protect those who still need protecting, and you tell no one what need not be said. Do you think she'll leave the village?" "No," Miss Marple said. "She's too proud. She'll walk with her head held high and act as if none of it ever happened. That's her punishment. And the watch? Let it be buried," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Let time stop where it belongs." She hung up and returned to her chair. The mist was rising again beyond the garden gate, curling low among the rose bushes. She picked up her needle, her hands steady. The truth had surfaced. The pattern was complete. And in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple began a new stitch, a new thread, a new watch unwinding slowly forward once more. The next few days in St. Ervon's passed with a quiet, cautious rhythm, as though the village itself were waiting to exhale. There was no announcement, no arrest, no scandal printed in the county papers. The Reverend resumed his duties with sombre composure, and Sergeant Mackell, though visible, kept his movements subtle. The garden party was spoken of again only in soft fragments, references to the weather, or the lovely sponge cake, or the tragic collapse of that poor museum man. No one said the word murder. No one said, watch. Miss Marple, for her part, returned to her routine as though the summer's disruption had been nothing more than a brief shower over her peonies. She visited the grocer. She wrote a letter to her niece. She took tea with Mrs. Bantry and commented, quite sincerely, on the quality of the blackberry jam this year. But beneath that calm exterior, her mind continued its careful turning. Because though the watch had been returned and the motive for silence understood, one thing remained unresolved. Not the cause of Mr. Feeney's death. That had, she believed, occurred precisely as described. A sudden failure of the heart, spurred by panic and the confrontation of secrets. No, it was not how he had died that still troubled her. It was why he had come at all. Feeney had not stumbled across the watch by chance, nor had he simply been assigned its appraisal. His notes, hastily written and recovered from his hotel room, made repeated reference to a name, Heartstone, and beneath it, scrawled in the margins, two phrases, letter hidden and traceable through clergymen. That was what had brought him to St. Ervon's, not idle curiosity, but deliberate research. He had known the watch's provenance, at least in part, and had followed its chain of inheritance directly to the Reverend. But that suggested something more than just professional interest. It suggested prior knowledge, and prior knowledge required a source. Which brought Miss Marple, on a soft Thursday morning, to the steps of the County Records Office in Biddlecombe. The building was modest, red brick, ivy creeping up the west wall, and inside it smelled of yellowed paper, furniture polish, and long-forgotten intentions. A young clerk directed her to the archives room, where, with gloved hands and a quiet "Grace," she began to turn through records from 30 years ago. It took over an hour, but eventually she found what she was looking for. A brief article in the Biddlecombe Gazette, dated the 2nd of March 1928. Local music instructor resigns. Abruptly, Miss Lillian Hartstone, employed for 6 months at St. Irvan's Parish Hall, has resigned her position citing personal matters. Parish sources report no cause for concern. There was no mention of scandal, no allusion to letters or impropriety. But Miss Marple had been alive long enough to know how papers told you what wasn't being said by how precisely they said everything else. A woman vanishing after a short tenure. A surname nearly erased from the village's memory, but not entirely. What followed was another hour with the probate ledgers, where she discovered the final thread. The will of Lillian Hartstone, filed the year before her death. The named executor was not a solicitor nor a family member, but a man called John Feeney. Miss Marple closed the book and folded her hands. Mr. Feeney had not simply been a museum appraiser. He had been the late Miss Hartstone's nephew. That changed everything. She returned to St. Irvan's before dusk and went directly to Sergeant McKell's office, where he sat reviewing the week's reports with a pencil, and the weariness of a man who'd spent too much time pretending not to know what he already suspected. She knocked softly and entered without waiting. "I've found something," she said, without preamble, "and I believe you should see it before dusk." To his credit, he did not ask questions. He rose, took his coat, and followed her down the main road, past the war memorial, and up toward the old east edge of the village, where the trees thickened and the earth grew quiet. She led him past the last row of cottages and into the narrow path behind the church to a sloping graveyard with leaning stones and ivy-covered names. They stopped before a modest headstone worn by rain and moss, bearing a single name, Lillian Hartstone. No dates, no epitaph. Miss Marple placed one gloved hand against the stone. "She came back," she said softly, quietly, "not to live, but to rest. And I believe Mr. Feeney arranged it, perhaps out of guilt, or duty." McKell stared at the stone. So he knew the whole time. Yes, he knew what had happened to her, and he knew about the letters. He was never going to appraise the watch. He was going to retrieve what had been hidden. McKell's voice dropped. "To clear her name?" Miss Marple turned, her eyes thoughtful. "To sell the story, most likely. He was not a kind man. Ambition makes people clever, but not good. He would have published what he found, ruined the legacy of a dead man to glorify a woman he had never truly known." McKell exhaled. "And Mrs. Jerome?" "She knew who he was," Miss Marple said quietly. "Perhaps not at first, but when she saw his reaction to the watch, when she heard him speak the name, it all fell into place. She acted to stop him, not out of cruelty, but loyalty, the last act of devotion to a man she loved, and a sin she's been repenting for ever since." McKell crouched and cleared a fallen twig from the base of the stone. "And the watch? It's in your care now, but the truth inside it, well, that need not go further than it already has." He looked up. "Do you think she'll speak of it?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but she'll live with it. That's punishment enough." They walked back through the trees without another word. The following day, the vicarage bell rang as usual for morning prayers, and the parishioners filed in with lowered heads and quiet hymns. Mrs. Jerome sat in her usual pew, her back straight, her gloves immaculate. She looked ahead without flinching, though she did not sing. At the far end of the row, Miss Marple observed her with the calm patience of someone who knew that endings were rarely clean. They frayed, they echoed, they bled quietly into the next beginning. When the service ended, Mrs. Jerome stood. Her eyes met Miss Marple's for the briefest moment. Not a plea, not thanks, but an acknowledgement. Outside, the drizzle had lifted. The village, too, was beginning to breathe again. And Miss Marple, ever modest, ever observant, turned back toward Church Lane, where the kettle waited and the day could begin again. The following week arrived with a gentler light, the kind that filtered through the lace curtains of Saint-Hervin's cottages, with a grace that made everything seem cleaner, softer, easier to accept. But the village, though still and polite on the surface, had not forgotten the garden party. It had simply folded the incident into its rhythm, as it did with every unspoken sorrow. Through nods across church aisles, through longer pauses in shopfront conversation, through the avoidance of certain names in polite company. Miss Marple knew the signs. She had seen it happen before, how a village, like a human heart, bandaged itself slowly after a wound. And yet something lingered. She noticed it first in the bakery. Mrs. Lockett, never one to withhold speculation, had grown unusually quiet. Then in the post office, where old Mr. Cranley had faltered while handing her change, as if distracted by something just beyond his line of sight. It was in the hush that fell whenever Reverend Allgood walked past the greengrocer's. A shared silence, not of judgment, but of knowing. And beneath it, a question that had not been voiced. Who had really known what the watch contained? Miss Marple's steps that morning did not take her to the shops. Instead, she walked past them and turned left at the narrow lane that curved behind the schoolhouse. An old path, now less used, where the hedgerows grew taller and the trees met overhead in a quiet arch. The earth was damp beneath her shoes, and a robin flitted low across her path before vanishing into the underbrush. She was not walking aimlessly. There was one last piece of the puzzle she had yet to examine, something too delicate, too volatile, to approach before now. But the time had come, not for confrontation, not for accusation, but for understanding. Horace Hale's cottage stood tucked into the slope of a hill, its windows wreathed in honeysuckle, and its gate slightly crooked. He was in the garden when she arrived, kneeling in the soil, his hands dirty to the wrists. When he looked up and saw her, there was no surprise, only resignation. "You've come," he said, brushing his palms off on his trousers. "I have," she said gently. "May I?" He gestured toward the bench under the apple tree. She sat. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was full. Miss Marple let it stretch until it thinned. "You knew about the letters, didn't you?" she said quietly. Not what they contained, perhaps, but that they existed. Horace didn't answer right away. He sat beside her and picked at a loose thread on his sleeve. "I was 13 when she left," he said at last. "Lillian Hartstone. I didn't understand it all then, just that something had gone wrong. My aunt, my mother's sister, had been kind to her, taken her in for a few months before she got the teaching job. They were close." He swallowed. "I used to hear them talking late at night, whispering. One night, Lillian was crying. She said something about being watched, about not being careful enough. I remember those words. Not careful enough." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And your aunt? She said she'd protect her, that no one would ever know." A week later, Lillian vanished. He looked at Miss Marple, not pleading, but trying to be seen. "Years later, after my aunt died, I found a note in one of her hymnals. Just a name, Feeney, and a line. If it ever resurfaces, find him first." That's when I started looking into it." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. The pieces slid into place with the slow, inevitable certainty of falling dominoes. "And when you saw the watch at the vicarage?" "I knew," he said simply. "Not exactly what it held, but what it meant, that someone had failed to keep it hidden, and that Feeney, somehow, had found his way back to it." Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I wasn't sure what to protect," Horace said. "My aunt, Lillian's memory, the man in the letters, who I didn't even know by name, and because I was afraid." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out a small envelope. She held it out. He took it with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a photograph, aged and curling at the edges, of two young women standing arm in arm in a garden. One was unmistakably Lillian Hartstone. The other was Mrs. Jerome. Horace stared at it. She wasn't only protecting the man, Miss Marple said quietly. She was protecting the woman as well, herself, and perhaps you. He looked up, startled. She was your mother, wasn't she? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Miss Marple rose, brushing the folds of her skirt. She left something behind, Horace. But not just in the watch. In people. In choices. In silence. He stood as well, the photo still in his hand. What should I do? He asked, his voice raw. Now that it's all over. Miss Marple looked at him with a kindness that held no pity. You do what people have always done, dear boy. You live well. You speak gently. And when the moment comes, because it always does, you tell the truth. She walked away, leaving him under the apple tree with the photograph. By late afternoon, the clouds had broken. A golden warmth spilled over the hedgerows and rooftops. Children's voices floated across the green, and the clinking of teacups resumed on garden tables. Mrs. Jerome, from her parlour window, watched it all with a composed stillness. Her eyes were unreadable. On the side table beside her, her gloves lay folded, unused. At the church, the Reverend lit a candle and did not speak. He stared into the flame for a long time. Sergeant McKell filed his final report in quiet, closing the folder with a pencil mark and a sigh, and Miss Marple, in her chair by the window, resumed her needlework. The stitches were small, precise, each one connected, unhurried, to the last. The pattern was slow to emerge, but it would, because in St. Hervins, as in all places, truth could not be undone, only delayed, and sometimes the watch had to run backward for the whole of time to begin again. It was early evening in St. Hervins, the kind of quiet hour when the last post was delivered and most parlour lights had not yet been turned on. The sky held a pale amber hue, and the rooftops glowed gently in the hush. In this small pause between daylight and lamplight, truth often found the space to breathe. Miss Marple had just finished a letter to her niece when she heard the knock, not hurried, not nervous, but deliberate, as though the one behind it had been gathering courage for some time. She opened the door and found Mrs. Jerome standing there, impeccably dressed in dove grey as always, her hat in her hand. "May I come in?" she asked, voice crisp but not cold. "Of course," Miss Marple said, stepping aside. They sat in the sitting room without tea, an omission neither of them commented on. Mrs. Jerome glanced once about the room, as though cataloguing it, then folded her hands in her lap. Her gloves were missing. "I imagine you know why I've come," she said. "I believe I do," said Miss Marple, not unkindly. "I suppose you've already drawn your conclusions." "I prefer to think of them as patterns," Miss Marple replied. "Some threadbare, some still uncertain. But yes, most of the stitches are in place." Mrs. Jerome's mouth twisted slightly. Not a smile. Something closer to exhaustion. "He wasn't supposed to die. Feeny. I didn't touch him." "No," said Miss Marple gently. "But you frightened him, and you took back what you believed was yours." Mrs. Jerome gave a quiet breath, as if some invisible weight had begun to shift. "I tried to stop it from ever surfacing. The letters, the affair. Lillian was reckless, but she didn't deserve what happened. None of us did." Her voice lowered. "He was going to destroy everything. I couldn't let him." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You protected someone, not just the man in the letters." Mrs. Jerome looked up sharply, then slowly nodded. "I protected the boy," she said. "Horace, my son." The words settled between them. "Did he know?" Miss Marple asked. "Not until recently," she said. "I had hoped he would never need to. But he came back, and then the watch appeared, and I saw the fear in Feeny's eyes, and realized I had less time than I thought." She stood and began pacing the edge of the carpet, her voice calm but resolute. My brother helped conceal the affair. He arranged for Lillian to leave. He took the letters from her, promised they would be destroyed, but he kept them. Perhaps he couldn't bear to forget her. Perhaps he wanted a way to explain someday, and when he died, the watch was passed along, quietly, without any understanding of what it contained, until Feeney traced it back. Miss Marple spoke softly. "And you already had the decoy watch?" She turned, surprised. "Yes, I had it made years ago, just in case. I never thought I'd need it." "It's always the cautious ones who survive," Miss Marple said, her tone neutral. "But your caution was not enough. Mr. Feeney died, and the watch, I returned it," Mrs. Jerome said firmly. "Unmarked, no fingerprints. I made sure. Let them read the letters if they must. There's no crime in what's past, only in what's done to protect it." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And Horace? He thinks I protected him from shame. But the truth is, I protected him from grief. The grief of knowing what he'd lost, what could never be restored." She paused. "I've lost him anyway, haven't I?" Miss Marple's voice was steady. "I don't believe so. He's still deciding what kind of man he wants to be, and that takes time." They sat in silence once more. Mrs. Jerome looked smaller than she had on any other day, less austere, less sure. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said after a long pause. "Then don't ask for it," Miss Marple replied gently. "But perhaps ask for understanding. It has a longer shelf life." Mrs. Jerome rose, hat in hand, and gave a small nod. At the door, she paused. "It was never about hiding shame, you know. It was about preserving love, what little we were allowed to keep." And then she was gone, leaving Miss Marple alone, with the dimming light and the steady ticking of the clock above the mantel. An hour later, as the street lamps began to flicker into life, Horace Hale made his way to the church. He did not go inside. He stood at the gate, looking at the gravestones, one in particular. He did not weep. He did not speak. But when he left, his shoulders were straighter, and the photograph Miss Marple had given him was no longer in his pocket. The next morning, a letter arrived on Sergeant McKell's desk. It was unsigned, but inside it was a short note and the original documents found in the watch. Letters, folded tightly, brittle with age. McKell read them once, then placed them in an envelope and locked them away. There would be no inquest, no charges. There was, after all, no crime left. At the next Sunday service, the pews were full again. The Reverend delivered his sermon with quiet grace. Mrs. Jerome sat in her usual place. She did not bow her head. Horace sat 3 rows behind her. Neither of them looked at the other, but they remained. And outside, as the congregation spilled into the churchyard, Miss Marple paused beside the old sundial. The stone beneath it bore the same inscription it had for decades: "Time reveals all things." She smiled softly to herself, adjusting her gloves. Not always, but it tries. And sometimes, with a bit of help from an observant old woman, it succeeded. The week that followed was one of tentative stillness, as though St. Hervance had drawn a lace curtain across the recent weeks and was peering out at the world through softened light. There were no more whispers at the bakery, no lingering glances at the churchyard. Mrs. Jerome resumed her regular errands. Horace Hale worked in his garden. The Reverend offered his sermons without tremor. It was, on the surface, as though time had realigned itself. But Miss Marple knew better. Restoration in a village such as this was not so much a return to normal as it was a careful stitching over a rupture. People did not forget. They simply resumed. And underneath that resumption, small ripples continued to disturb the quiet. It was during one such ripple that she received an unexpected visit. Sergeant McKell arrived just after tea, his coat damp with early mist and his hat in his hands. He looked, as he always did when visiting Miss Marple, vaguely apologetic, as if his official presence were some accidental offence. "I won't take long," he said. "Just a loose thread." She showed him in and gestured to the chair opposite her sewing table, where a half-finished doily lay beside her spectacles and a shallow dish of sugared almonds. The lamp glowed warmly. "Loose threads," she said with a faint smile. "Always the most revealing kind." He cleared his throat. "It's about the watch." Her eyes didn't move from his face. "I thought the matter of the watch was settled," she said softly. "Nearly," he replied. "But we had it examined by a restorer from Dorchester, just to be sure. The contents, the construction, all very routine. And, well, inside the casing, behind the letters, almost hidden in the seam, we found something else, a photograph, quite old, folded so tightly it looked like part of the mechanism." Miss Marple said nothing. Her silence encouraged him. "It's of two young women," he said. "One is unmistakably Lillian Hartstone. The other isn't Mrs. Jerome. It's someone else." Miss Marple's fingers stilled against the fabric in her lap. Dark-haired, slightly older, but unmistakably familiar. Mikkel leaned forward. "It's Mrs. Hale, the one who raised Horace." The aunt Miss Marple looked at him now, and for a moment the flicker of calculation passed behind her steady eyes. "I thought you should know," Mikkel said, "because the photo changes the narrative, doesn't it? Mrs. Jerome wasn't protecting herself, or even her lover. She was protecting her sister." There was a long pause. "No," Miss Marple said finally. "She was protecting both." She rose and crossed to the small bookshelf by the fire. From behind a slim volume of Cowper's poetry, she withdrew a folder. It had been there for days. She opened it and drew out another photograph. This one crisp, printed recently. She handed it to him. It was the same two women, but older. Lillian, in a garden, and the other, in a smart coat and gloves, standing with one hand on her shoulder. "Taken in 1931, Miss Marple said, before Lillian disappeared for good. The woman in the coat was not just her friend, or her host. She was the mother of Lillian's child." Mikkel's brows lifted. "She was barren," her sister said, "and heartbroken. Lillian gave up the child to her." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but firm. "You see, Horace was not just a ward. He was the link between both sisters, one whose love was illicit, the other whose love was empty of fulfillment. So they created a fiction. Lillian vanished. The sister raised him. And Mrs. Jerome, the third woman in the circle, kept it all intact." Mikkel sat back. "So Horace was raised by one mother, unaware of the other, and protected by a third." "And none of them ever told him," Miss Marple said, "until Feeney arrived, until the watch surfaced. Then the balance, built so delicately for decades, began to tilt." She returned to her chair, her hands resting on the embroidery without resuming. "I wondered why the story felt unfinished, why Mrs. Jerome never seemed entirely central, even as she moved so precisely. It's because she was the guardian of the secret, not its source. She bore the burden not for herself, but for the women who could no longer speak." Mikkel nodded slowly. "And Horace? He'll learn in time," she said. "Or perhaps not all of it, but enough to know he was loved, deeply, and by more than one woman who made hard choices in silence." The sergeant stood, tucking the photo carefully away. "I'll file the report," he said, but gently. Miss Marple gave a slight nod, her eyes warm with approval. Gently is often best. After he left, the room grew quiet again. The ticking of the clock, once more the only measure of movement. Miss Marple turned back to her sewing, but her thoughts wandered. What lingered now was not guilt nor suspicion, but memory, layered and fragile. The kind of truth that, when revealed too forcefully, could shatter rather than illuminate. And yet, in revealing just enough, in lifting only the necessary corners, something else had been preserved. Not justice, not quite, but understanding. That evening, as twilight deepened into dusk, Horace Hale walked alone down Church Lane. He passed the church, paused at the gate, and kept going. Not into the graveyard this time, but up toward the meadow, where the trees opened onto a wide view of the downs. He carried nothing, no photo, no letter, only the memory of a conversation he'd had with Miss Marple 2 days earlier, quiet and unforced, with more silence than speech. And in that silence, something had been returned to him. Not answers, but roots. Miss Marple, back in her sitting room, lit the small fire and placed her embroidery back in the drawer. The pattern, for now, was complete. There would be other mysteries, other shadows. But this one had settled. It had unwound slowly and gracefully, like the final turn of a key in a clock made to run against time. And now it rested. Outside, the sky turned lavender. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then fell quiet. And in the house on Church Lane, the watch that had once counted backward was no longer ticking. But time, as ever, moved forward. The sun had just begun its slow descent behind the gentle rise of St. Hervans hills, casting long golden fingers across the village's tidy gardens and narrow lanes. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of late summer roses and freshly turned earth. Inside Miss Marple's sitting room, the flame of a solitary candle flickered, lending a soft glow to the quiet woman seated by the window. Her hands rested on the arms of her chair, her eyes tracing the last slant of light as it settled. Outside, the village appeared peaceful once more. But the stillness was the kind that follows a storm, not the absence of disturbance, but the calm that comes with understanding. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the recent revelations, to the intricate web of love, loyalty, and secrecy that had ensnared St. Hervans for decades. She recalled how the backward-running watch, so peculiar and seemingly whimsical, had become the silent custodian of a hidden past. Concealing a letter, a photograph, a confession, relics of forbidden love, and the quiet sacrifices made in its name. The death of Mr. Feeney, far from a simple tragedy, had been the catalyst that set the village's secrets in motion. A man driven by ambition and family ties, tracing a legacy that others wished to keep buried. His confrontation with Mrs. Jerome, a woman who had dedicated herself to protecting not only the reputation of a man long gone, but also the fragile lives of those still living, had ended in panic and an unintended fatal collapse. But the story did not end with grief and accusation. It had unfolded gently, revealing a triad of women bound by blood and circumstance. Lillian Hartstone, the gifted but ill-fated music teacher. Her sister, the stern and protective matriarch who raised Horace. And Mrs. Jerome, the steadfast guardian of the secret, who had carried the weight of truth in silence. Horace Hale, once a boy unaware of his lineage's complexity, was now a young man armed with knowledge tempered by compassion. The photograph Miss Marple had entrusted to him symbolized not shame or scandal, but the resilience of love shaped by hardship. Miss Marple mused how, in a village like St. Hervans, time seemed to hold its breath, then exhale slowly, revealing truths not with a shout, but a whisper. The watch had run backward, yes, but now, at last, it was free to run forward. Her gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a simple clock ticked steadily. A soft smile touched her lips. Justice had been served not through verdict or punishment, but through understanding, the rarest and most gentle form of resolution. As the candle guttered low, Miss Marple leaned back, content in the knowledge that, for now, the village could heal, and that sometimes the quietest hearts hold the deepest truths, waiting only for the right moment to be heard. Outside, the evening deepened, stars blinking awake in the velvet sky as time continued its endless, graceful dance.